Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. That is what the writer of the book of Hebrews wrote in chapter 12. Over the last few years, on the last Sunday in May, I have endeavored each year to introduce to you one of the pioneer pastors from the state of New Mexico by bringing them to life again. This year, I have enlisted the help of Reverend Don Cummings, who for several years now has spoken to different groups portraying John Dyer, a pioneer pastor in Colorado, who also helped bring Methodism to New Mexico. This is the first part of his portrayal of John Dyer. I will post more of this presentation on the New Mexico Conference website in the days ahead. But here now is one of those who is a part of our own great cloud of witnesses in New Mexico.
Hello, my name is Father John Dyer. I'm 87 years old, and I've come here tonight to reminisce about my life and ministry in Colorado. Most of you know the part of my story in the early part. There are actually 3 different segments of my lifetime here in Colorado. I was age 49 by the time I got here, and from 1861, the year of my arrival, through 1874, I call those the pioneering years. Those were the years that I spent a great deal of time going around to the various mining camps in central Colorado preaching the gospel. And I had many interesting experiences and really few bad experiences in the mining camps of Colorado. I arrived in Buckskin Joe July 4th, 1861, and I really had only come out to Colorado to see the Pikes Peak region before returning back home to Minnesota and continuing my life as a preacher and a lead miner. But the week that I spent in Buckskin Joe convinced me that there was a great need for religion out here in Colorado Territory during the gold rush. And so the first Sunday I was in Buckskin Joe, I gathered together a crowd of people under a pine tree and preached the gospel. And their reception of the message encouraged me to think that perhaps God had sent me to Colorado for a larger reason than just my own curiosity. Long story short, as you folks are akin to say these days, I never returned to Lenore, Minnesota, my home there. I spent the rest of my life preaching and ministering here in Colorado, mostly along the Front Range and in the mountain camps of central Colorado, as I said. In 1862, that winter, because Methodist preachers made so little from preaching, I had to turn to other employment to get me through. And so someone who had been delivering the mail from Buckskin Joe, which is near Alma, over Mosquito Pass to Oro City or Leadville, decided he did not want to make that trip during the winter months. So he was looking for someone to take his contract. Well, it paid a pretty good stipend, and so I said, I'll take it. I must confess I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but crossing Mosquito Pass in the winter months turned to be a daunting challenge. And I made that trip at least twice a week. You probably know Mosquito Pass has a lot of snow in the wintertime, and it's the highest mountain pass, at least it was the highest mountain pass that I had encountered personally up to that time. So the only way to get across Mosquito Pass in the wintertime, you couldn't go by horse, the snow was too deep. You couldn't go by foot, you'd sink up to your eyebrows. So back then, if you needed to travel in the wintertime, you made a homemade pair of Norwegian snowshoes, we called them. They were 9 to 11 feet long, and you tied your boots to them with a leather strap, and that was all that kept you afloat on the snow going over the passes in the mountains during the wintertime. I lost the other skis of this pair somewhere up around San Elmo. So if you're around San Elmo and you find my ski, you call them skis, we call them snowshoes, please return it to me because this one's rather lonesome at this stage in its life. And you couldn't just start out any time of day to get over Mosquito Pass because during the day when the sun was shining, the snow softened up, and you're even on snowshoes, you would sink down into the snow, or the snow, being wet as it was, would collect on your skis, your snowshoes, and you'd have to take a couple of steps and then take your 9-foot pole, as long as the snowshoes were, and knock the snow off the snowshoe before you could continue on. It was a laborious and exhausting process. So I soon discovered that the best time to start out over Mosquito Pass was not during the daytime, but in fact at night. About 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the snow would have refrozen and a hard crust formed over the softer snow beneath, and then you could cross on snowshoes without undue danger to yourself. So that's when I made most of my crossings across Mosquito Pass. And that's also why it became known as the snowshoe itinerant. Now, how many of you might be Methodists or have some Methodists in your background here? Well, that's a pretty good representation, more so than many of the audiences that I've spoken to. But the rest of you may not know what the word itinerant means. And it means, in reference to preaching or preachers, a preacher who circulates around a circuit. He doesn't have a stationary appointment, one church, where he lives in a parsonage for a period of time. The itinerant circuit-riding preacher was always on the move. Now in the East, they mostly traveled by horse. In the West, some of them did, but I couldn't afford a horse. Ownership of a horse has a lot of expense and responsibility to it. And number one, I didn't make enough money to own a horse or keep it. And number two, there was nothing wrong with my feet. After all, I had walked over 800 miles from Lenore, Minnesota to arrive at Denver and then go on to Buckskin Joe. And in my early years, there was a Methodist annual conference held in Denver, and I could have taken the stagecoach from Buckskin Joe all the way into Denver for $10 one way, $20 round trip, but I didn't have $10, not even for one way. So I started 2 days early and I walked to Denver from Buckskin Joe. I received my appointment and I walked back to Buckskin Joe. And I walked to most of the places that I went in Colorado. The one exception was when I was appointed to start the Methodist work in New Mexico Territory. Now, I had had some brief encounters with New Mexico Territory, and I had written a letter to our bishop and said, there's great opportunity awaiting the Methodist Church in New Mexico. We should send somebody who understands the Spanish language to go down and begin the work. Well, the bishop kind of cooked on that for a year. And then at the following annual conference, he called on me and said, Brother Dyer, I know you don't know the language, but you know more about the territory than anybody else we have in Colorado. So he appointed me to go to New Mexico and begin the Methodist work there. That was the time I invested in a horse. And over the year that I was in New Mexico, I rode about 10,000 miles on horseback, visiting all the settlements that had been established at that time. And of course, the Roman Catholic religion was very prominent in the New Mexico Territory. They were there first, long before anybody else went there. And they had established missions and churches nearly everywhere where there was a population. And so the going was not altogether friendly for a non-Roman Catholic oriented preacher to come in. In fact, the Roman Catholic Bishop of New Mexico had given instructions to his people that they were not to host me in their homes and they were not to allow me to hold preaching meetings in their homes. Well, some of them ignored that and did it anyway. And that year was a good year of ministry, establishing the Methodist work in that region of the New World. I also brought to New Mexico a man named John Harwood and his wife to help me in the ministry in New Mexico Territory. And as it turned out, they specialized in education. And so they started schools all across the territory and actually have been recognized as some of the pioneers of the education system in New Mexico. So both John and I were both surprised and saddened when we came back to Denver for the next annual conference, and the bishop up and away appointed me to a charge back here in Colorado, leaving John and his wife alone to do the Methodist work in New Mexico. You see, we had known each other in Minnesota, where we both answered the call to ministry and became ordained as Methodist preachers. And we've become even more fond of one another the time that we served together in New Mexico. So it was a sad and in some ways bitter parting when our paths went different directions. But that's another part of being a Methodist. We served where the bishop sent us. That was part of our commitment, part of our ordination vow, that we would go where we were sent. Generally, no questions asked. And we might complain, but it would do no good. And so we embraced even the hardest of appointments because we believed it was in service not only to the church, but more importantly, in service to the Lord.